Biologics and biosimilars are such a hot topic in terms of competition and innovation, and they're at the core of issues that we care about in the United States today. And so some might think that Washington's broken and maybe it doesn't do as much as it could. But on the issue of drug pricing, I really see a bipartisan push now from not just Democrats, but Republicans as well to get something done because prices are too high. Oftentimes it's not related to innovation and patents. And so really something needs to be done. And I think biologics are the place where these issues are even more pressing because we don't know exactly what we're dealing with. We don't know the relationship between biologics and biosimilars like we do between brands and generics. We don't know all the barriers to entry, all the new ways that biologics are keeping biosimilars off the market. So it really is exciting stuff. So what I'm going to do is talk about biologics and biosimilars in terms of 6 types of conduct, several of which we have seen before and several of which we have not. And so I'll first talk about 3 that we have seen before, the area of product hopping, sample denials, and citizen petitions. And then I'll talk about 3 that have new angles that we have not seen before. So the first is patent settlements, where there's an issue of patent thickets that we have not seen before. The second is the rebates issue. And the third is disparagement, this last one being completely new in this setting. And so as we've heard about this morning, there's a difference between biosimilars and generics. It's a lot more expensive to create a biosimilar. It's a lot more complicated. We don't know exactly what we are dealing with. And in addition, we have exclusion that we don't have in the small molecule space. As Nicholson has written about in great and helpful detail, there's trade secret protection that we don't have in the small molecule space. So there are a lot of challenges here. And then the question is, well, how does this apply and how is this different from what we have seen in the small molecule context? And so the first activity that I'll talk about is product hopping. Product hopping happens when a brand company switches from one version of a drug, like a capsule, to another, like a tablet. Most of these reformulations are fine. Most of them do not present competitive concern. Empirical analysis has shown that 80% of them take place outside the generic window, outside the time that we expect a generic to enter the market. So a lot of times the brand company is making a switch because it's actually a better product. On the other hand, some of these switches are done just for the purpose of keeping generics off the market. Because when brand companies switch from one version of a drug to another that's just a little bit different, they could get a patent, another patent, which could keep the generic off the market. They could get more FDA exclusivity. They could, at a minimum, force the generic to reformulate its product, getting another couple of years. They could make it so that it's not substitutable at the pharmacy counter. You have state drug product substitution laws that allow you to switch at the pharmacy counter. So for all of these reasons, the brand company has a significant interest in keeping the generic off the market through product hopping. How does the biologics industry differ? My big picture observation is that it might be a little harder to do. In the small molecule context, it's pretty clear how you tweak a drug just a little bit. I think it's a lot more predictable. In the biologics context, it's not quite so easy. And so my prediction would be that there'd be a little less product hopping percentage-wise than you would expect in the small molecule space. When it does happen, what should we do? We might take some lessons from what the courts have done in the small molecule space while perhaps thinking of other ways of doing things. So in the small molecule space, courts have focused on the distinction between hard switches and soft switches. With a hard switch, the brand company pulls the old drug off the market. And courts say, oh, that's bad because you don't have a choice. The old one is gone, and now the consumer is forced to take the new one. And so that's fine, but then they get it wrong when they say that soft switches are okay, because with a soft switch, you're leaving the old drug on the market. And so some courts, like the Walgreens court in a case dealing with Prilosec and Nexium, said you have 2 products on the market, 2's better than 1. Consumers have tons of choices. I don't think that's necessarily right when the markets in the pharmaceutical industry are not exactly like the markets for most products, where the consumer makes the price quality trade-off. They don't do that here, where the doctor is the one making the decision to prescribe the drug and the patient or insurance company is the one making the decision to purchase the drug. And so I've offered a test called the No Economic Sense test. It asks if there's any reason at all for making this change other than hurting the generic. Again, most of the time, these changes are going to be fine. There's a new market, there's a new innovation, there's a reason for a brand company to make this switch. But when the brand company makes a switch that, for example, in the case of Alzheimer's drug Namenda, cost it $1.5 billion. It was a $1.5 billion drug. It pulled it from the market. Why would it take such a profitable drug and take it off the market? It makes no sense, other than keeping the generic off the market. And so that's the analysis that I would recommend, asking if it makes any economic sense at all for the brand company to do what it's doing other than harming the generic. The second type of conduct that is similar to what we've seen in the small molecule space involves the denial of samples. Primarily, this takes place according to a program called REMS, Risk Evaluation Mitigation Strategies, where the concern is that the drug is not safe. So think of thalidomide. You could have birth defects if you take the drug. And so the FDA wants to make sure that the drug is distributed in a manner that's safe, that there's a restricted distribution system or something like that. So that sounds fine. The problem, though, is that the brand company then takes this REMS restriction and uses it to keep the generic off the market. So maybe with a restricted distribution system, the generic is not able to get a sample in as many places. Maybe the brand company says, nope, I'm not going to give you the sample. I have concerns about safety. And the problem is that the generic company needs to have the sample. Under the Hatch-Waxman Act, which Congress passed in 1984, the generic was not supposed to replicate all of the costly clinical trials that the brand companies were engaged in. The generic company was supposed to have a sample and use that sample to show that it was the same, to show that it was bioequivalent to the brand drug. So if the generic never gets that sample, then it can't even enter the starting line. And so that's the concern here, that brand companies are denying samples, that generics need to enter the market. And this is an issue that has gotten bipartisan condemnation. The commissioner of the FDA, Scott Gottlieb, has said, brand companies, why don't you stop the shenanigans? And he's actually used that term. He really gets it. And he's a guy with a background in the pharmaceutical industry. He knows what's going on. This is very concerning. Something that Congress is thinking about as well. There's a potential piece of legislation called the CREATES Act that passed overwhelmingly, including several conservative Republicans, out of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And so this is really a problem. How would it apply in the biologic setting? Well, I would say it would apply just as much, because the biosimilar would need at least as many samples as the generic company does. Again, it's complicated, not as easy to show that the drugs are equivalent. And so therefore, the biosimilar could use more, might even need clinical trials in a way that brand companies would not. And so this threatens to be just as big an issue in the biosimilar setting. What sort of analysis should courts apply? Again, I'm a fan of the no economic sense test in antitrust law. It's a conservative test. It gives the defendant every benefit of the doubt. Defendant, as long as you have one justification for what you're doing other than keeping a competitor off the market, then we will let you win. So it's even more deferential than the analysis that's typically applied in antitrust law called the rule of reason, by which a court balances anti-competitive and pro-competitive effects. And so I would say that when you apply the test, it seems like the biologic manufacturer would be violating the test because it is denying a sample by which it would make money. The biosimilar would pay the market rate in the small molecule context. The generics have paid or promised to pay far more than the market rate. So why then is the brand company turning down a profitable sale? Doesn't make sense other than harming the generic. So the REMS context is a second one, where I think we can see a lot of similar conduct as we have seen to date. The third type of activity involves citizen petitions. Citizen petitions are designed to raise legitimate safety concerns with the FDA. There could be a problem with a drug. Maybe the drug is unsafe. And so a competitor could tell the FDA about a safety problem, and that's really important and something that we should encourage. The problem is that even though it sounds important in theory, in practice, it is oftentimes used to harm the generic. So I've done a couple empirical studies. My most recent one found that 92% of citizen petitions that were filed by brand companies against a pending generic were denied, and that figure rose to 98% for late filed petitions within 6 months of the expiration of a patent or exclusivity period. And so basically, brand companies are filing these petitions to keep generics off the market. Every day in which you keep a generic off the market could be millions of dollars in its pocket. And so that is what we've seen in the small molecule setting. How would this apply with biosimilars? Well, because there's a little bit more of a difference between a biologic and a biosimilar, you could say that there might be a legitimate reason to file a petition. The brand and generic are basically the same. In certain rare instances, there might be a difference. And so you could say, well, a citizen petition is frivolous when you're saying, oh, the two will be completely different. With a biologic and biosimilar, there is an argument that there is more of a difference. So maybe there's more room for a legitimate citizen petition. Nonetheless, we still do need to be aware that this is a temptation for the biologic company to file one of these things to keep the biosimilar off the market. And then from an antitrust perspective, there is petitioning immunity under a doctrine called Noor-Pennington, but there's a sham exception. And so if this is sham conduct, then it is not allowed. And so I would say that in some cases this is sham conduct. The FTC filed a case challenging frivolous citizen petitions saying that this was a sham. And so this is a third type of conduct to think about. Shifting now to three types of conduct that are new, at least in part. The first involves settlements. So we have seen for the past couple of decades a lot of attention on settlements of patent infringement litigation, and the concern is when a brand company settles the case by paying the generic to delay entering the market. The payment is the concern here. So oftentimes we have settlements. Settlements are good. We have settlements of patent litigation. That's good. The concern here is the payment and the extra exclusion that you can get. So imagine that there are 10 years remaining in the patent term. The parties agree that there's a 50% likelihood that the patent is valid and infringed. They could agree that the generic would enter the market in 5 years. And most people, including the FTC, would say that this is fine because it's exclusion based on the strength of the patent, and you're allowed to do that. Now imagine that the brand company says, you know what, generic, I'm going to give you $100 million. So if we go back to 2003, that would be in a bag of cash. If we go to 2018, it would be for a generic service that it doesn't really need. So generic, I could use your promotion capability. And we'll think about the commercials we see on TV, think about how good the brand company is at promoting, but say somehow, you know, the brand's not good at promoting here, but the generic is really good. So the brand will pay $100 million for the generic to promote its drug. A lot of these are really questionable. And at the end of the day, it's just a disguised way to make a payment of $100 million. And so however the payment is made, the concern is that the brand company's keeping the generic off the market through the payment. So instead of 5 years of exclusion, now the generic won't come in until year 8. And those 3 extra years stem from the payment rather than the patent. And so that's the concern in the small molecule context, that the exclusion is coming from payment. So what do we then do in the biologics setting? So I'd say if there is payment, then the same analysis applies, and this should be anti-competitive. But let's say that it's exclusion based on the patent, and let's say that we have a patent thicket. So Humira is the case that Nicholson talked about, which is really an interesting case because here there are more than 100 patents. And the brand company has settled with just about every generic with the exception of one. There's entry in 2023, and AbbVie is fond of saying there's no payment. And so I was in the media talking about this. I said, well, the sentiment's a bit concerning. So AbbVie gets back to me the next day and says, you know, by the way, there's no payment. And so I don't know because I don't get to see the agreement. The FTC does. But let's just say that AbbVie's right. There's no payment in the form of cash or any other compensation. Then the question is, well, what happens when you have 100 patents? Does that change the equation? In the small molecule setting, we say, is it based on patent or payment? Here, if it's based on patent, then it's fine. So under that reasoning, then this is fine because it is based on the patent. but does it change the analysis at all if there are 100 patents? And so it's just a really interesting question. The one case that is being litigated now involves Boehringer, who has claimed the unclean hands defense, that the patents were obtained not for innovation, but that they got overlapping non-inventive patents. And they quote the CEO of AbbVie, who says that any company now has to contend with its extensive patent estate that it intends to enforce vigorously. So is this evidence of unclean hands, or is it evidence of rigorous patent enforcement? Good question, and those will be where the interesting issues arise. Assume no payment. What do we do with patent thickets we haven't seen in the small molecule setting? The second type of new conduct involves rebates. So rebates sound great in theory. Bundled products and discounts, those all sound great in theory. It's money that's going back to the consumer. The problem, though, is that these can be used to keep biosimilars off the market. Imagine if a biologic company says, you can have, insurance company or PBM, you can have my products, but you have to take all of them. Or I will give you a rebate, a really big rebate, but you have to promise not to deal with the biosimilar. And so this is something we've started to see in the small molecule context, but we'll see even more in the biologics setting. There is a case that's been filed by Pfizer against Johnson & Johnson. Pause for a moment. It's filed by Pfizer. I mean, Pfizer is not the small plaintiff we usually see in the small molecule setting. And so you have Pfizer suing Johnson & Johnson because it's so expensive to create biosimilars. We're seeing brands on both sides of the equation. And so Pfizer's suing, saying that J&J did everything possible to keep its competitor to Remicade, called Inflectra, off the market, and said, hey, insurance company, if you want to deal in our products, if you want a rebate, you have to promise not to deal in Inflectra. And sure enough, 90% of the accounts did not purchase any Inflectra at all. Inflectra only had 4% market share. And so at the end of the day, this is a case going on where it's really interesting because, again, on their face, rebates sound pro-competitive, but when they're done just to keep the rival off the market, when if the rival would offer its product for free and it still wouldn't be worth it, then there is potential anti-competitive harm. And then finally, we turn to a new type of conduct, disparagement, that we have not seen at all in the small molecule setting. In the small molecule setting, the brand company is not going to say, that generic is unsafe. I would not do the generic. It's so completely different than the brand, because they're basically the same thing. In the biologic space, in contrast, they're different. And so the biologic could say, you know what, if you want to stay alive, maybe you shouldn't take that biosimilar, or something else, maybe not so subtle, to say that there are real concerns here. And so that is the problem, that there's a difference between the biologic and the biosimilar. We don't know exactly how they would operate. And the concern is that the biologic would try to scare the consumer into thinking that the two are not exactly the same. And so there was a citizen petition filed by Pfizer with the FDA saying that there should be more efforts on the FDA's part to make sure that this deceptive advertising is not allowed. And so it talked about examples of Genentech, who on the website says, oh, be careful about biosimilars, they're not identical. Talks about Amgen that says, oh, patients are reacting differently, and maybe you shouldn't switch if the medicine is working. And so these are examples of biologic companies trying to scare the ultimate purchaser or consumer into not getting the product. And again, this is not something we've seen in the small molecule space, and it's worth paying a lot of attention to. So in short, we have decades of experience in the small molecule setting. I think that will be very instructive in thinking about the harms presented by product hopping, sample denials, and citizen petitions. And we can also learn some stuff when we think about patent settlements and rebates that we learned before. With disparagement, we're on new ground, but still we can think about the anti-competitive harm that is at least potential here. Thanks so much.
I'm going to exercise the privilege again and start. So So could I get you to say a little bit more about disparagement? Because, I mean, that's a commercial tort, right? But you're talking about it as a type of antitrust claim, right? I mean,
Right.
Is it just that the terminology is the same, or is there a connection between the two of them? I mean, is it that I would sue you for the tort and also raise the antitrust claim, or what? How's that work?
So it's the same concept, but it's dressed up in antitrust language.
Okay.
So it is a claim that the biologic company, which likely has monopoly power, is using a whole bunch of tools to keep the biosimilar off the market, and disparagement is one of them. And so then the question is, well, what sort of analysis do we apply? And courts have done different things in the small molecule setting. Big picture, taking a step back, under monopolization, you need to show monopoly power and exclusionary conduct. For exclusionary conduct, one question is this conduct that makes any sense other than harming the generic or harming the biosimilar? So there you could say, well, they're playing with the system. They know that you're not going to be a biosimilar unless you're very similar to the biologic. And so they're doing something that is keeping the biosimilar off the market. They're getting monopoly power as a result. So I'd say it's the idea of disparagement dressed up in an antitrust case.
Do we see that in other markets? I mean, well, don't use this shampoo, even though it claims to be just like my shampoo, because your hair will fall out or something.
Right. So there have not been that many cases. And I think in the pharma industry in particular, this is going to be new conduct. On the other hand, there have been some cases, and some courts say, nope, we're not going to deal with it at all because this is more like a tort action. Other courts say we'll go case by case. A third set of courts will look at, it's like 5 or 6 different factors to see how much confusion there was and things like that. So it's still an open question as to exactly what courts will do.
So if I understand what you're saying, I'm going to expect to see these complaints, right, that bundle up, disparagement, tort, some type of trademark. What's the word I want for trademark disparagement? Not dilution, but tarnishment.
Right.
Some type of tarnishment and an antitrust claim for antitrust disparagement.
Sure.
Package.
Sure, they could. So the difficulty with an antitrust allegation is it's very complicated. So you have to define the market and have experts and litigate a case that oftentimes is more complicated than the other ones. But if you have the money, then it's certainly possible.
I should shut up.
Yeah, Nicholas.
So I have 2 questions. The first is a little bit more doctrine. Well, it's more predictive what's going to happen. I'm curious as to what you think is going to be the kind of end equilibrium with state automatic substitution laws for biosimilars, and how this plays in particular into the last 2 dynamics that you talked about, the rebates and the disparagement issue. The second question is a broader one that people keep asking me and I don't have a great answer, which is, it seems like drug companies have gotten sketchier. And
Really?
and maybe I'm wrong. I have this sense that the pricing issues, and it's just the pricing issues, and we're gonna do everything we possibly can to keep our competitors off the market. I have this vague sense that things are worse now in some way, and maybe that's wrong. Maybe this behavior is not sketchy because it's just the market being awesome, or maybe it was always this sketchy. I'm curious as to if you have an impression on that, if actually things have changed, and if so, if you have any thoughts as to why.
Sure. So for the first, I don't think substitution will be nearly as effective for biosimilars as it was for generics. For generics, that's how the market works. And so you have a fragmented market, and the one place where prices go down is the pharmacy counter, because the pharmacist either has to or has the option of switching a generic for a brand. Instead of the brand, you get a generic, and that's how the market works. With biosimilars, I don't think it's going to be the same. One reason is the nature of the drugs themselves. If they need to be infused in a hospital setting, then the pharmacy counter is less relevant. The other thing is, and maybe now starting to get into your second question, is that the biologics industry jumped on this from the beginning to make sure that the substitution laws are not as effective as they could be. So there are significant record-keeping requirements. Sometimes the doctors have to be told if there's a switch. And so there's a significant effort underway to make sure that these laws are not as effective as they could be. Plus, we also have the FDA determining interchangeability. That hasn't even been satisfied yet. So I don't think this will be as effective. In terms of the second, I think that Big Pharma has been playing more games now than they did before. Maybe it's because they're more desperate as they run up against patent cliffs. Maybe it's because there's more consolidation and they feel less constrained in doing so. But certainly they have been able to do it. So take a step back through the last 2 decades. Settlements have been going on since the late 1990s, and the FTC was on it in 98 and 99. But that was really it around that period of time. Product hopping developed in, I'd say, 2000 to 2005. We saw some examples, and so that's continued for the past couple decades. But then something like sample denials is pretty new. That's just in the last decade and not something we've seen before. And then once you think you have it all figured out, there's always something new. The transfer to the Native American tribe to avoid review at the patent office. Who could have seen that coming? I mean, so I think about games that Big Pharma plays for a living. I never would have imagined that this is something that you could do. Nonetheless, they did it. And it looks like it was struck down in so many different ways. I mean, Allergan said, oh, wow, we didn't realize this would be viewed so hostilely. And not only did they lose in the district court with an incredibly thorough opinion, finding all the patents obvious, but also they got a huge backlash where a lot of people said, you know, we know Big Pharma doesn't play by the rules, but this is a little much because it had nothing to do with tribal immunity. It's not like the tribe was involved in innovation. And so my sense is that it's gotten worse. The thing that's really interesting is that the whole system has gotten worse. And so for this, I go back to Heather Bresch's testimony in Congress a couple of years ago about the EpiPen. So the price of the EpiPen had gone up to $600 from something like $50 several years before. And she was before Congress and said, oh, I know it looks like a lot, but we're actually not making anything from this. It's all the middlemen who are making it. And as a result, people said, no, that's not right. But then people start to think about the PBMs, the pharmacy benefit managers, and they have now gotten a lot of flack for not giving back rebates. So PBMs are supposed to lower costs. What happens is in this completely opaque process, they have the brand companies give them a really big rebate. The brand company pays for that rebate by increasing the price. And as a result, the PBMs get a lot of money and the price goes up. So the interesting dynamic here is that the PBMs and the brand companies are sort of at war with each other, which makes it more likely that we'll get legislation. So I'd say the whole system is messed up. The brand companies are doing more than they did before, that PBMs are as well, and we're in a situation in which we really could use some help. Timo.
I have a comment rather than a question. Of course, in Europe, after the pharmaceutical sector inquiry from 2009, we had a lot of very interesting cases, like the Lundbeck decision,
right,
which concerned us in Copenhagen a lot, for example.
Sure.
And I think where you really get a lot of information on what's going on are the Commission reports. The Commission every
right,
year has to report on the state of the European Union, basically with regard to patent settlements.
Right.
And these reports are really interesting to read. You see
yep,
how the settlement activity has switched. You know, we distinguish between the so-called A, B1 and B2 categories,
right,
depending on if there's a value transfer involved or you know, that they share production facilities and production and selling experience and these things. And you can see really that the settlements where there is no value transfer involved, and
right,
especially those where there's no effect on generic entry, those settlements are really have been skyrocketing after the Commission and the Commission's actions. And
right,
I think that is really interesting to study these kind of settlements.
Absolutely, because you see the same thing in the US. And so after Europe started paying attention to it, there still were settlements, but not the concerning kind where there's delayed entry and payment. And the same thing in the US. And so from 2000 to 2004, there was rigorous enforcement at the FTC. There was a decision in 2003 that said that these things were per se illegal. And so you had settlements, but no payment. There were 20 settlements, 0 involved pay for delay. Then between 2005 and 2012, the court said, forget about that, do whatever you want. It's within the scope of the patent, it's fine, settlement's a good thing. So we saw in that period that the number of pay-for-delay settlements skyrocketed. 2012, Third Circuit said this is a problem. 2013, Supreme Court and activists said this could violate the antitrust laws. Now we've seen the number of pay-for-delay settlements go down. Each of the past several years, it's gone down a lot, and the number of total settlements has gone up. And all this shows is that antitrust enforcement matters. When you have the antitrust agencies and courts saying that it's not okay to pay your competitor to stay off the market, they're not going to do that. They're still going to settle the case. And there were 170 settlements in the FTC's report the last fiscal year. They're still settling the cases. It's just that they're doing it without payment. And then one final point is that this will now finally be done for biologics and biosimilars. So up until a few months ago, this was not something that the FTC could see. The FTC sees every settlement each year under the Medicare Amendments Act of 2003. This was not something that it could see for biologics and biosimilars. As part of the legislation that prevented gag orders, that prevented pharmacists from telling patients that the price is actually lower without insurance, there's a provision in that bill that said that biosimilar settlements need to be reported to the FTC. And so that is really important. So now the FTC will see what's going on as well. Yes?
So I wanted to think a little bit more about the pricing element. So as we know, these drugs are incredibly expensive to create, to get into market, whether it's the biologic or the biosimilar. There's excessively high costs that are associated with innovation in this area. And so if we think about, not from an antitrust perspective, but from a pricing perspective, let's say we crack down on pay for delay and we really step up antitrust enforcement, and you have, let's say, a duopoly, right, of two large companies coming in. Why doesn't the brand name competitor just increase the price, let's say, 5% each year, and then when the biologic has the competition, the biosimilar enters the market, suddenly you're paying the same amount for the biosimilar as you were for the biologic 5-10 years ago. And so that's not really an antitrust issue, right, as long as there's no side agreement. And yet that would still be a situation, right, that you can envision happening. And I guess I'm wondering, is that kind of a seventh potential issue there, or is that something that we kind of just say is what the market will bear?
So one of the things that I love about antitrust in the drug pricing debate is that it allows me to not have to wade into the innovation versus access trade-off. So there's so much going on now in terms of drug pricing. And there's discussion from the extreme polar opposites of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump to say that we should do international reference pricing and peg the price in the US to the average of 5 industrialized countries overseas. And so that would get the price down. There's a ton of other proposals that would get the price down. And in all of these proposals, there's the question, okay, the price would come down. Would that affect innovation? And so I don't know if anyone knows the answer to that for sure, but the fun thing about doing antitrust is that I don't have to make those determinations because I know that it's an antitrust violation when a brand company pays a generic to stay off the market or makes a switch that is absolutely trivial, like having a tablet and putting a second score on the tablet instead of a first score. And that's enough to keep the generic off the market. So in all these instances, we can lower price while not hurting innovation. And so I think a lot of money would be saved. The FTC said that $3.5 billion a year would be saved if we got rid of pay-for-delay settlements. Sample denials cost $5 billion a year. So I think that there's a lot to do with antitrust in terms of the brand company increasing the price because it expects competition to come later. That generally isn't an antitrust problem. But the sooner we could get generic entry on the market, the better. And the FDA has had for years this chart that shows the number of generics on the market and how much the price goes down. And so I'd say, in short, the quicker we could get generic competition, the better for pricing while also not affecting innovation.
Just a quick follow-up. That chart, though, assumes that we're dealing with small molecule drugs, right, which are a lot less expensive for generics to create. And so
right.
The generics are not kind of in the same position in terms of the cost that they have to outlay
That's right.
Reduce the small molecules.
Yeah,
right? So just
no, absolutely right. So the price will not go down as much, and we've seen when biosimilars enter the market in Europe that the price does not go down as much. And so the competition won't be the same, but still, every day that the biologic keeps the biosimilar off the market is a day that we're not getting the lower prices that perhaps we should have.
Last quick question.
Yeah, Jake.
Yeah, so in the small molecule context at the very least, I'm thinking of Revlimid specifically. It seems like the new hot thing to do are volume limited licenses, right? You know, you could only sell maximum of, 20% of the total script sale, blah, 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 right? And this is one way of effectuating, please think of it this way, a pay for delay without actually paying anyone any cash. At the same time, it preserves a duopoly, right? Which is actually good for pricing from both sides' perspectives. So it's like this optimal scenario. Have we seen this in the biologics context? Do you think we're expected to see volume limited licenses as settlement opportunities in the biologics context? Or, yeah, I'm just curious of whether something we've seen or you expect to see.
So it's certainly possible, and you're right. It gets rid of the anti-competitive pay for delay settlement. That just looks bad when you're paying someone to stay off the market. Here, in contrast, you're having someone enter the market. And so all of a sudden you flip it and it sounds more pro-competitive. You're right, though, because what's your default position? And if your default position is that, say, it's not a good patent and you would have had the biosimilar on the market a lot faster, then this is reducing output. And so I think it is concerning, and that's why I don't like the scope of the patent test, which we had in settlement law that said, well, you're entering before the end of the patent term, so therefore it's good. And I just thought that assumed the fact that the patent was valid and infringed. The same here. I think that given what we know, there's a chance that in many cases this is reducing the output, so that would be a problem as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thanks.